The future of space games is single player. I'm not sure if that should be a statement or a question, so let's leave it open for now. But what I do know is that things are changing for the genre. For the past 6 to 8 years, 3 big space games have dominated the market, but 2 of these titles are very much in a state of flux. Elite is now an aging title. Arguably, once the dominating force within the genre, the game has now moved into a new phase. Like all great MMOs, it continues to be a special game, but, in my opinion at least, it's no longer the reference point for space games. Meanwhile, Star Citizen is still years away from being a full game. Sure, it's playable right now, but it's lacking any significant gameplay loops. And then, we have No Man's Sky, and this is where things get really interesting. In 2016, No Man's Sky released as a single-player game. Today, 6 years and over 20 updates later, it is still predominantly a single-player title. Sure, it has social hubs and some multiplayer missions, and players can of course co-op together. So, let's call it a single-player shared experience with some multiplayer elements. Out of the 3 big space games then, Elite, Star Citizen and No Man's Sky, it seems clear to me that No Man's Sky is the one that has very clearly the brightest future, and it is also heavily influencing the genre. But is the future of space games truly single player focused? Well, let's think about that one a little bit more. Developers CIG are not building only Star Citizen, but also Squadron 42. Naturally, there's plenty of misgivings about when or even if that will release. Nonetheless, Squadron 42 is arguably the more important CIG project. It's where CIG are repeatedly stating they are placing the majority of their focus. Sure, the code and tech behind Squadron 42 will ultimately benefit Star Citizen, but for now, Squadron 42 is an extremely big deal for CIG. Theoretically, it's also a big deal for the industry, a huge project funded with hundreds of millions of dollars, headlined by a cast of A-list actors, and if you believe the hype, it's quite possibly a game unlike anything before it, but yeah, we'll have to see. Ultimately, regardless of what happens with Squadron 42, whether it fails or succeeds, it will be an immensely important moment for the space game genre. Squadron 42, as it happens, is also a single-player title. Moving on to the other end of the spectrum, we have Everspace 2. This one has been in early access for a while now, but it's set for full release in 2023. And sure, this might not be created on a budget of hundreds of millions of dollars, and nor does it have a cast of A-list actors. But what it does have is epic gameplay, a truly gorgeous visual world, breathtaking space vistas, and some great-looking planetary surfaces, as well as much, much more. The release of Everspace 2 then is a key upcoming moment for the genre. It's also a single-player title. And then we have the big one, Starfield. Releasing in 2023, this one is not only a key moment for the space game genre, but it's also one of the most anticipated games, full stop. Whilst naturally this is totally an RPG, it is also a space game. With 3 flight spaceships, hundreds of different planets and moons to land on, not to mention space stations, this is clearly heavily space focused. And yes, it's also a single player title. Now, if we look further afield to a game that may end up never even releasing, we have Beyond Good and Evil 2. Whilst not a lot is known about the game, it's also very likely in developmental flux and possibly even developmental hell. But there's 2 things we do know, however. Space is a prominent aspect of the game. It's also a single player title. And beyond that, there are a selection of other upcoming titles. But here, it really does depend on how far you push the definition of space game. But let's take a look at a few titles anyway. The excellent-looking Haunted Space, a single-player space simulation set in a grim, dark future where you can trade, craft, explore and fight. Star Wars Eclipse and The Outer Worlds 2, both single-player space adventures. And then there's Homeworld 3. Now this does have multiplayer components, but first and foremost it is a single-player experience. The more I look, the harder it is to find any upcoming space games from well-established studios that also happen to be a multiplayer. The near to mid-term future of the space genre then most definitely seems to be single player. But where does that leave Elite Dangerous and Star Citizen? Well, as I mentioned in a previous video, Elite is doing just fine, but it's also very unlikely to be attracting new large audiences. It's also unlikely in the extreme to be taking any steps that redefine the genre. Star Citizen, meanwhile, is a long way from completion, and whilst it's certainly playable now, and plenty of people do seem to enjoy it, it's nonetheless far from a complete experience. And No Man's Sky, of course, is not only continuing, but is doing so in a truly inspiring manner. Yet, whilst it has plenty of multiplayer aspects, as I said, it is far from a traditional multiplayer game. But we're looking at the future here, that is, upcoming and so far unreleased titles. So the big question for now is, Star Citizen aside, where are all the big budget multiplayer MMO space-styled games? For better or worse, it seems the selection of upcoming releases in that area is extremely slim. The future of space games then is single player. I'm still not sure if that should be a statement or a question, but at this point it's kind of feeling that it really should be a statement. Do let me know your thoughts and feelings on this in the comment section below. Do you think the single player is the way to go for space games, or do you think we should be seeing more multiplayer titles? What is your preference? As always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys and girls next time.